Bene. Good morning, my relatives. This is Mark Charles, and it is Friday, January 19th, 2024. I'm sitting down with my second cup of coffee, and I'm very excited about the show we have today. I'm going to be talking with a longtime friend of mine named Scott Hall. We actually met over 20 years ago back at UCLA, and he is doing some really good work, has started a podcast, and we're going to have a conversation today. But before I begin, I want to do like I always do, which is acknowledge I'm speaking to you from what's now called Washington, D.C., but these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of the lands where I'm living. I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. And I just want to state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So we're going to have this is a special conversation we're having today where Scott and I are going to be talking for about 30 to 40 minutes here on my second cup of coffee. And then after this, we're going to go over to my Patreon where we're going to have a more in-depth Q&A there. And if you would like to join the Q&A on Patreon, if you're not a subscriber yet, you can actually subscribe even today, and you can join the Q&A there. It's going to happen about 5 or 10 minutes right after this podcast ends. And you can join us on there if you subscribe to what's called the Ask Questions tier. And you can even subscribe just for 1 month, and you can join this Q&A, and during that month, look at the archive of a lot of other Q&As I've done and other things we put up there over the past 2 years. But anyway, let me bring on my friend Scott, and we can get this conversation started. So, Scott, thank you for joining me today. It's so good to have you here.
Good morning, Mark. It's great to be here.
So, I hope do you mind if I talk a little bit about why you're in this dark room there? So,
I would love it. Partly
Scott,
because it's still dark outside over here.
So Scott lives on the West Coast. He lives in Seattle. And I asked him why he was in this darker, kind of more remote room today when we talked. And he said, well, he's on the very tail end of recovering from COVID. And I just recovered from COVID just a few weeks ago. My wife had it about a week or two later. And so I know exactly where it's at. So Scott, I thank you for, even though in the midst of your isolation there, you still are able to turn on your video camera and jump on and join me for this conversation today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Mark. And because of friends like you and mentors, I am just south of Seattle, at the city of Kent. But it's the historic land of the Muckleshoot tribe and the Duwamish and Coast Salish people. So I'm grateful for your leadership in recognizing the land that I'm on and coming from.
Well, thank you, Scott. I appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate your land acknowledgement that you just gave. So we met 25 years ago, 20 years, 23 years ago, something. I think you're a year or two younger than me. But we were at UCLA together. We were both involved with the same Christian fellowship. We lived in different dorms, but we definitely knew each other, spoke regularly throughout college, and went kind of in different ways post-college, but still managed to stay connected over the past 25 years. I think we talk maybe once or twice a year. We'll kind of touch base at our cross paths at a conference, or see each other, or give each other a call every now and then. But yeah, maybe tell us a little about who you are and what the work that you're doing is.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, it's been a long time. I came to UCLA in 1990, so that's a long time. I grew up. We're old. That's what I'm secretly saying. I grew up in Oakland, California. Oakland is pretty well known as being kind of a West Coast center of the Black Power movement. But I grew up in the hills, which were mostly white folks, but in public school. And so in a really diverse school system. So my whole childhood, I was like aware of sort of economic disparities by race, but no one ever talked about it in my sphere. Not at home, not at school, not at church. Um, I came to UCLA, and as you probably remember, there was this incident, which at the time was a big deal because cell phones weren't around. But someone caught on video camera some white police officers beating a man named Rodney King, and when those two officers were acquitted, there was just an anger that erupted in the city, became known as the LA riots. And I happened to be in an African American studies class at the time, and my professor stopped all of what she was planning and had us study the history of racial uprising in the United States. And something just hooked me, that I felt like for the first time, what I was beginning to learn about my faith in Jesus and issues of justice and my upbringing and my school all converged. And so I changed my major to African American Studies in 1992, and it sort of launched me on the beginnings of a journey that I've
Yeah.
been on ever since.
I remember what happened after the Rodney King verdict came out, and I share all the time. I was raised as a white evangelical, so even though I'm Native, my grandparents were boarding school survivors. They were forced to shed their culture, and so I grew up in a home and in a church that didn't acknowledge much about my Native culture, Native identity, and I grew up very much as a white evangelical, and grew up with a lot of the same blindness or implicit biases that a lot of white evangelicals have. And I remember after that verdict came out and there was the violence that happened, and we were out, there were a lot of us that were out around the city just cleaning up, and we were helping out to clean up different areas. And I remember I was working outside alongside this African American man, and I asked him something about the riots or something about, like, where were you, or were you around when the riots broke out? And he said, "Oh, I see who you are." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, the way you refer to it implies where you stand on the issue,
That's right.
right? Many of us saw this as an uprising or as something else, but the people who are in power see it as a riot."
Yeah.
And that was really eye-opening for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I already was on a journey to understand more of my Native identity. I was already on a journey of figuring out, hey, I'm a Native man in this very non-Native environment here,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was already become more aware of that. But when he said that, and he said, just the language you use, the fact that you called it a riot,
Mm-hmm.
reveals your bias.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, yeah, you're right. And that was kind of an eye-opening experience for me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I incorrectly said 25 years. It's been almost 35 years, right? Because it's 1990. I graduated high school in 1989. So yeah, we've been friends longer than a decade longer than I acknowledged at the beginning. But so Scott, you started a podcast,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm assuming one of the reasons you started, I don't know all the reasons behind you started it, but I hear this critique a lot. And I'm sure as a white man, you hear it even more. In fact, I give this critique, which is so often when it comes to issues regarding race, right? It's the people of color, people like myself and others, who bear the brunt of the work to do the education, to lead the charge, to fight the fight, to get the change that's needed.
Mm-hmm.
And white people kind of come behind and participate in that, but they're not doing the work.
Right.
And I've heard more than once people say, and I know I've been tempted to even just say myself, like, we need white people to step up and to invest their own energies into detangling all of this yourself.
Yeah.
And I find it very fascinating that you call your podcast White People Work.
Yeah.
We're very much, and I forget what your longer tagline is, but it's about how white people need to step up and take responsibility for their place in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else you want to say that went behind you choosing this title of White People Work for your podcast?
Yeah. As I'm listening to you, Mark, there's a guy. He's pretty active on Twitter. I think he's a school teacher in Chicago. His name is Dwayne Reed. I think he said something like, "White supremacy won't die until white people." Something about stop feeling compassion for the Black community and taking responsibility for it. Essentially, it's like this is going to change when white people actually step up and do something about white people's problem. And I know I'm probably making a lot of fans. Talking about white people is always it's always interesting. Um, there was a African American pastor in 2015, Michelle Higgins. She has a podcast called Truth's Table. She was preaching at Urbana on Black Lives Matter, and she had a little moment when she said, "And white people listening, you need to stop leaning on your friends of color to help you understand and fix yourselves. You need to start doing your own work and do your white people work." She might have even said that phrase, but that's where it comes from, is an exhortation from an African American activist and pastor. And I sat there, Mark, thinking, I already told the story how I became a Black Studies major in 1992, and what I was when Michelle Higgins said that, I was immediately convicted. I didn't know if anyone else was in the room, but I knew. I felt like, you know what? I'm using my cross-cultural learning to be the white guy in the room that's like the good guy, that people of color are like, "Oh, you're one of the good ones." But I'm like, I'm using it for me, but what am I doing to actually change systemic racism and make the world different? I need to like work on my own self and talk to my own people. And that's how the
Yeah.
podcast started.
Well, I've listened to several episodes from your podcast, and I was particularly drawn to episodes 2 and 3,
Mhm.
where you kind of define historically what whiteness is and where it came from. And I'm going to share a link to your podcast in the chat right now, so people who want to can follow along or can go to it later. I see Shantina's on. Yeah, hey Shantina, thanks for joining. Steve Yazek, yeah, hey Bennett, thanks for joining this morning. It's good to have you here. But yeah, I episodes 2 and 3 of your podcast from season 1, which was last year, you talk about the historical definition of whiteness, and you start with a conversation you had with Leon Su from Hawaii. He's a native
Mhm.
Hawaiian and a good friend of mine and someone I've known for a while. And I'm glad you had a chance to talk with him. And he kind of got you to understanding that one of the major differences between white people and indigenous people is that white people have no sense of place.
Mhm.
The community is not defined by geographical areas or boundaries. It's defined by race or defined by color.
Mhm.
And I want to first talk a little bit about that and the insights you gained from him, but then you go on to define whiteness as really being an identifier of not as much who you are, but who you're not.
Mhm.
And so the contrast between, as the black race was becoming more defined and being used as enslaved labor, whiteness was being defined as that's not who we are. We're not black, we're white, and we are superior to that. And so it really was this definition of defining people not by who they were, but by who they were not, and even by who they felt they were superior to. But yeah, I'd love to go back and just any other thoughts you have about your conversation with Leon and about how his indigenous worldview gave you some insight into the start of your podcast.
I appreciate you bringing that up, Mark. And just to give you a little bit of credit also, I think where Uncle Leon was so significant for me is he was so gracious with me. And I just want to say that in the midst of kind of what can be a loaded conversation, my experience as a white person, as I've tried to take steps into understanding myself, I think sometimes white people think that folks of color are out there just looking to put us on the bottom and tromp all over us and sort of just reverse the hierarchy of power. My experience is just so different from that. And as I talked to Uncle Leon about wanting to grow, he gave me permission to explore. He's like, "Do you find it confusing to be white, Scott?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do." He goes, "Do you want to know why?" I was like, "Yes, of course I do." And it was just so wonderful. And Mark, I just remember for so long ago, you gave an analogy to me of like the United States, Turtle Island, as this house, and all these people are renting, but it's grandma way up in the attic who's this native woman that owns the house and saying, you know, I'm okay that you're here, but would someone please come acknowledge me and talk to me as the owner? I've carried that with me for so long. So I'm really grateful for that,
Yeah.
Mark.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, that metaphor of the grandmother in the house, I've used that frequently. It's on my YouTube channel. I've used it around the world to engage dialogue between colonizers and their indigenous hosts.
Yeah.
Um, and and yeah, so what I'd like to talk about is I'd like to even hear some of your own reflections
Hmm.
on what Leon challenged you, and especially where he said that whiteness is defined by race and not by place.
Yeah.
And how does that hit you personally as a white man in the United States of America,
Hmm.
where you're given all of this social standing, but there really is, I think, this deep insecurity among the white culture, right? White world. Yeah, we don't really have any place that we can call our own.
Hmm.
Like, how did Leon's words kind of even engage your own thinking in that?
Yeah. They gave me permission to acknowledge the complexity and confusion. And specifically, Uncle Leon said, indigenous culture is in a place, white culture is composite culture. It's an enmeshment of a whole bunch of cultures, like for utilitarian purposes. And that combined with, excuse me, sorry, my COVID is kicking in a little.
Oh,
No, I'm good. It combined with the work of Dr. Willie James Jennings as well, and the Christian imagination, and he fills out a lot of that race versus place. And what I did a few years ago, Mark, I had a sabbatical, and I won't. This is actually on my webpage. I created like a 10-foot long timeline of the history of like race and whiteness and all of the origins. It goes back to about 300 BC. I mostly have a historian from Princeton, Nell Irvin Painter, to thank for that. Her book, A History of White People, guided me. But Uncle Leon gave me permission to go on that journey of identity and recognize that until the 15th century, like whiteness, it didn't exist. Like there's a pastor who was in Barbados that had to come back to England, and I think this was in the mid 1600s. And there was literature from Barbados talking about white people, and he had to interpret for them because like, what do they mean by these white people? And English people didn't understand that. It's like, wait, you're saying we're the same as French and Dutch and Germans? Like what? And he had to say, oh yeah, well, in the New World and in the Caribbean, you're just all kind of one thing. And that was a brand new concept. And so I think what it did for me, Mark, is it allowed me to go, okay, the only identity I've been given is one that's defined, just as you mentioned, against who doesn't get to be in the inner circle. Because that's what's weird about whiteness as well. If you ask Benjamin Franklin in 1755, you can read his speech to Parliament. He's actually advocating, he's articulating a eugenics based argument, which is sort of scary because he's on our $100 bill. And, if you know what I'm talking about, that led to Nazism. But Benjamin Franklin is saying, you know, all these swarthy Swedes, and he's going down this list of all the people that don't get to be in his little inner circle that he calls whiteness. And you think about the history of US immigration and Irish people, or Italian people, or Polish people, or German people that were ostracized and not in the little inner circle. So it's a sliding scale.
yeah,
So it's not an objective thing. And so if it's not rooted in a place, what's it rooted in? And I think fundamentally the problem with whiteness, I don't think whiteness can exist without anti-blackness fundamentally. That's the context in which it was defined. But of course, in this land that we live on, it was an anti-native, later anti-Chinese, anti-Indian. Mexican or Latino, and it's a broken understanding of ourselves, that if whether wherever you come from, if you feel like we as a people need to have a rooted sense that something generative and positive, then I think you need to have a hard time and challenge whiteness as a fundamental identity.
Yeah. Yeah, I again, a lot of this content, and you give a lot of your sources and your references of where some of this terminology comes from, and you credit all that. But in episodes 2 and 3 of season 1, I really appreciate the way you kind of started the conversation in your podcast with laying out what is whiteness and how is that being defined. And I especially appreciated the way you laid out how, yeah, it's a moving target, right? There's no one, and depending on where you look in our history, whiteness is defined differently over the ages.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, again, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, that's because it's defining itself by who you're not
Mm-hmm.
and who you're superior to, rather than who you are as a group of people and where you come from.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I I want to bring up, there's a lot of things that we could go off on in
Yeah,
this, and
there are.
kind of tangents we could take. One of the other things I want to talk about, there's another episode you had, I think it's episode 9 from season 1, where you talk about the danger of white progressives.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that you gave a clarification in the early part of that episode. You said, and just so you don't think I'm advocating for white conservatism, I am a white progressive. I am the definition of a white progressive. I'm a highly educated white man living in Seattle, and right, this is kind of
Yeah.
where I am and where I locate myself.
Yeah.
And you then gave a critique of the challenges of really where white progressives so frequently fall short.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for myself that is a very common experience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I remember when I ran for president, and I was running in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of white progressives who follow me, they follow my work. And there were a lot of people who were, long before I even talked about running for president, there were people who were publicizing my work and supporting it, and helping me out, and lending a hand to the stuff I was doing and all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I announced my campaign, or even if you go back further than that, once I said, okay, I'm going to do this protest at the Capitol, when we read the apology there,
Yeah.
right? It was all my very public facing institutional white progressives who were the first people to say, well, I can't support that.
Yeah.
Right? They couldn't come to the reading of the apology because they were on the different task force and commissions for the White House under President Obama. I was
Yeah.
critiquing President Obama, and they couldn't be seen sitting beside me critiquing a bill he had signed. They
Right.
couldn't, it was my white progressive friends who came to me in droves when I announced my campaign and said, I can't vote for you. It's too dangerous. Voting for you is like voting for Trump. And so they're like, yeah, once there's a tangible way to move forward and to actually address the systemic problem, a lot of my white progressive relationships and friends said, yeah, I can't go there. That's far too risky.
Mm-hmm.
That's more risk than I'm willing to take.
Mm-hmm.
And so I appreciated that episode you had. It was episode 9 of season 1. But anything else you want to go in more in depth on that, or insights you gained out of that, even about yourself as you identified yourself as being a white progressive in
Yeah.
your own space?
Yeah, Mark. I really appreciate you going in and listening to some of those thoughts. It means a lot to me. And yeah, I think my most recent insight is that I think for like the white overt racist, what you see is what you get. And there's not a gap between articulated like conscious ideals and unconscious practices. But I think for the white progressive, there's often a separation between conscious beliefs and like, here's who I am, here's what I believe in the world, but then unconscious embedded elitism that just sort of seeps out. And I find that there's this amazing book, I think, Counseling the Multicultural World or something. It's two Asian American authors, Sue and Sue. I think they say this in this book that non-white people tend to be much more aware of nonverbal communication. And so I think there's a way where white folks think what I say is the full definition of who I am in the world. And they're not aware that there's all these different nonverbals and unconscious things oozing out of who we are. That, and I think just so white people don't feel like I'm just piling on us, I actually think for the most part, I actually don't think that that is anything that most white people consciously desire or choose. I had this I sat at the feet of these folks. It's called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. They do anti-racist training. And African American man taught me, folks of color growing up in the ether of the United States develop an internalized racial inferiority. And he makes that articulation based on the doll tests. You can Google that and look that up. But then he says, so if that's true, and white people are growing up in that same context and ether, whether something is taught, it will be caught by white people, an internalized racial superiority.
Yeah.
Now, I promise you, Mark, when he told me that, I was like, no way, that's not me. I'm one of the good ones. I was a Black Studies major. Come on. And then I slept on it and my defenses lowered and I was like, he's right. But the
Yeah.
upside is this. When I name it, now I have agency over that unconscious conditioning. And I can say, one, I didn't ask for this. Two, I can do something about it. Am I going to deny it and just let the status quo play out? Or am I going to actively reject that conditioning and say, that is not who I am. I will seek out choices that will get me out from underneath a sense of racial superiority. And personally, Mark, I think until white people have that, come to Jesus moment, I think that it's like we put band-aids on these sores that are coming up from inside rather than taking the medicine
Yeah.
to heal from the inside.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, you go into so many of these discussions. A lot of I'm hearing you articulate some of the same things you said in the episodes I was referencing, and I really appreciate kind of the work. And one of the things you did, I forget if it was episode 9 or episode 3, where you talked about the difference between being white and embracing whiteness. And being white is something you can't control.
That's right.
It's your skin and where you are and where society places you. But embracing whiteness means accepting the narrative, even the false narrative that society's trying to feed you. And
Mhm.
while you can't change the fact that you are white, you can do something very proactively to reject whiteness
That's
and
right.
to reject kind of that narrative and that pedestal or that place that society will put on you.
That's
Um,
absolutely right.
so yeah, I found that very helpful.
Yeah, and if you'll let me just add one thing, Mark, I think part of the important moment for white folks is for us to realize actually we at a superficial level, of course, the hierarchical racial construct that is embedded into our unconscious selves, and that comes from scientific racism and all these different things. Um, it on the surface, it's like, well, that helps white people. I think deep down, the composite identity, uh, living under the ideology of whiteness, I think it actually harms us as human beings who are white because it tells us to define ourselves against other people. And I think it does this, it makes us try to be God in the world.
Yeah,
And I think for a human being to try to be more than human, I think it's toxic on our bodies, on our identities, on our relationships,
yeah,
and it poisons the way that we're supposed to be connected to each other in community.
yeah.
Sorry,
I mean,
Get me going, Mark.
I think you're saying something really important, and I don't know how closely you follow me on social media, but every year, once or twice a year, on my Twitter, I will tweet out, right? Because we always advocate Black Lives Matter, Native Lives Matter, right? We advocate for the agency and the humanity of the people from the margins. And every now and then I'll tweet out and I'll just say, white people are not superior. And I feel like we have to say that just as much as we have to say the people who are considered less are not less. We have to say the people who are considered more are not more, right? So the challenge is whiteness exists up here.
Mm-hmm.
People of color exist down here. The plane of humanity is right here. So we
That's
have to obviously lift up people who are below that plane, but we
mm,
also have to lower white people. And I've been called racist for saying white people are not superior. And if that just doesn't give you an idea of the implicit bias that and the air that we live in, that we swim in, that we breathe here in the United States, I mean that highlights it to the core.
mhm,
But yeah, I think we absolutely need to not just come against the narrative that says people of color are less than, but we
mhm.
have to also come against a narrative that says people who are white are greater than, are more than, and we need to find a way to bring that down to the plane of humanity where we can all interact with and coexist as peers.
I can't add anything to that. I agree 100%.
Yeah. So anyway, Scott, I really appreciate the work you're doing. I'm grateful that we've been friends for so long. I love it when we cross paths, crisscrossing across the country.
Yeah.
And yeah, I hope that you continue in this work. How's the second season of your podcast going? I know you're in season 2 this year. How's it going right now?
Yeah, it's been really great. For season 2, I've had so many friends of color over the years that have like shaped who I am today. And part of my like responsibility in the podcast is I'm trying to have conversations with white folks so they don't have to keep having the same conversation over and over with their white friends. So season 2 is me doing interviews with I think 8 different friends of color, and it's a really fun way to explore the conversation from that perspective. And yeah, it's been really good, and I'm days or weeks away from starting to record season 3. So
Okay.
yeah.
Now, in episode 1 of season 2, you
Yes,
talked about how not only were you going to shift gears a little bit and come in the side door instead of the front door, is the way you phrased it,
that's right.
but you also said you were going to be more intentional to promote and build the audience of your podcast.
Yes,
How is that going?
it's
How
rough,
how is
Mark. Here's the thing. I I think, I really do believe in a sense of vocation and purpose, and I'm 51 years old right now, and I think I'm sort of finding the sweet spot of who I'm supposed to be in the world with this conversation about race from a white perspective, where my own growth is connected to things that are helpful to other people. But I'm not a marketer, I'm not a promoter, and I've had friends help me, and I'm thinking about putting TikTok promotion out there, and my daughter is might help me with that. So it's coming along, but I'm sort of waiting for that surge of energy when I'm like, yes, I'm really ready to do it. So, if you want to like send me your good energy to help that, it's coming slowly, Mark, and I think it'll happen when it happens. I'm trying to like let the game come to me at the right pace.
okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Well, I'm just going to lay this out here, and I'll do this publicly here on my podcast. But as I've listened to the work you're doing, there was one narrative that I have in my book and that I use in my speaking that I thought whenever I give it publicly or people read my book, it especially brings out a reaction from white people, and usually a fairly kind of eye-opening positive one,
okay.
which is where I talk about perpetration induced traumatic stress and the way that I have learned over the past few decades to interact with white people as another group of traumatized people.
Hmm, right.
And that I get a lot of reaction from that from my book. I get a lot of reaction of people who they hear me speak about that, and they're like, it's so eye opening to understand kind of why I have these very strong reactions when things come up or things happen, and I almost lose control. I almost had an out of body experience of watching myself respond to something, like where is that coming from, or why am I behaving that way?
Yeah.
And so, if you ever want to have a discussion about perpetration induced traumatic stress and what I call the trauma of white America, I would love to engage some of your audience with that, and we could have definitely have a good discussion about that at some point.
I would love that, Mark. I really would. Yeah.
So yeah, as I was kind of listening through your thing, I thought, yeah, there's a lot of places where I think this understanding might probably help your audience at least become more self-aware
Yeah.
of why they have some of the reactions they have as they engage in these dialogues about race,
Yeah.
both for the white progressive as well as the white conservative. And I loved what you said about, I want to go back to the white progressive thing, because there's something, the way you articulated it reminded me of how I articulate it, where you said the white conservative, you kind of have the what you see is what you get. And I often talk about it as critiquing white conservatives is like critiquing or disciplining a 3-year-old, and critiquing a white progressive is like critiquing a teenager, right?
Hmm.
Where the 3-year-old, they have a very simple idea of what they're doing and why they're doing it, and they're almost kind of proud of what they've done. And it's very easy to both critique them and to show them what's going on. Whereas the teenager, right, they're a bit more nuanced. They're a bit better at covering it up. They're even better at like explaining why, no, this is a healthy thing to do. And let me explain why this is a good thing. And it should
Hmm.
be this way. And I find you actually have to invest more energy in critiquing the white progressive than you do the white conservative.
Yeah.
It's harder to get the white conservative into the door. It's hard to get them in the room because they don't self-select to come to these conversations. But
That's
once they're in the room, they're much easier to talk to. Whereas the white progressive is going to be a much longer, more drawn out, more invested conversation, because they're going to have all these arguments about why that's not going to work or why we shouldn't be doing those things.
That's right. That's right. And truth be told, Mark, I'm not good with the white conservative. I have a hard time. I have a good friend and colleague. She lives in Ohio. She has this series she does called "A White Grandmother Talks About Race," because she is a grandmother and she's white and she's so good. She comes in maybe more gently, and I think I've always lived on the West Coast and lived in these like more progressive areas. That's just kind of my context. So yeah, no, what
Yeah.
you're saying makes a lot of sense.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for joining me today. For those of you who have been enjoying this conversation Scott and I are having, we're going to jump over to my Patreon now. And on my Patreon, starting in about 5 minutes on a Zoom call, we're going to have a more in-depth Q&A. So if you want to continue this conversation, you can jump over to Patreon. You can subscribe to the Ask Questions tier of my Patreon site. Once again, I'm going to give that link here in the chat so you can join us there. And if you're a member of my Patreon already, you already should see the invitation to the Zoom call that's already been in the feed. We put it in there either last night or this morning, I think. And then for people who want to just learn more about the work I'm doing and even support my work, I'm going to put up a link where you can buy signed copies of Unselling Truth. And I'm once again going to put up a link to Scott's podcast, which is called White People Work. And I highly recommend it. And I hope you're able to take a listen to what he's thought about. He's done a lot of research, done a lot of reading. I haven't listened to as many of the interviews he's done in season 2, but I know a number of the people that he's interviewed, and I'm sure they're great conversations. So, Scott, anything you want to say as we're kind of closing out here?
Two quick things, Mark. For one, thank you. I really appreciate you making space for the conversation. Maybe you're going to give me that boost of promotional energy. I'm really grateful for that. But two, I think, Mark, all the conversation, it's interesting. The Unsettling Truth book, and I've heard you do your talk on the doctrine of discovery, and you co-authored that book with Sung Chan Ra. And there's something I read in one of his early books, and he's talking to a Christian audience, but it really has universal application, where he said, if you're a white I think he's talking to like missionaries or people in Christian ministry. If you're a white missionary and you don't have a mentor of color, you're not a missionary, you're a colonizer. And I think I just keep thinking of that through this whole conversation because I understand I might be making things harder for white people than easier because there's entering into the mess of what our whole identity is. But the thing that's really carried me through has been seeking out mentors of color. And I have found as I'm coming with a teachable posture that the Dr. Willie James Jennings and Dr. Randy Woodley, like these folks, Uncle Leon, have just been so generous in pouring into me. And it's just it's really pulled me more into my humanity. And I feel so grateful. And I just don't think we can move forward well as white people without those mentors and those relationships. And I'm grateful for you in that, Mark. I mean, we're basically peers, but you really function as a peer mentor for me in this journey. And I'm
Yeah.
just grateful. You don't have to be this way with us whiteys. But it means a lot that you're generous and giving and moving forward in mutual conversation. So thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Scott. It's been great to have you here. For everyone who's joining, Michelle Lloyd Page, Yate, thanks for joining. Steve and Matt, thank you for being here. It's great to have all of you. Debbie Gadberry, Yate, thanks so much for being on this with us today. Mr. Phil Fox, thank you for joining us today. If you like this podcast, please feel free to like it. Hit the like button. If you want to leave a comment on here. And if you're able to share it out, we also, not only do we stream this live on YouTube and on Facebook and on Twitch, but I put it up as a podcast. We call it Get Your Coffee to Go, and you can get the audio version of this on my podcast. It's uploaded to all the major podcast platforms where you can listen to it there and have it in your earbuds instead of just on your screen. But anyway, thank you, my relatives, for joining me today. Thank you, Scott, for joining the conversation. We're going to jump over to Zoom on my Patreon in a few minutes, but walk in beauty, my relatives, and may we all learn how to walk in beauty together.
Thanks,
I'll
Mark.
go on that.